Welcome back, everybody. We have a new video going over my opinion on every single champion in TFT right now. And we've been playing this set for around 3 weeks now, so I think it's fair to say that we kind of know what we like and hate about every single champion, including the ones from last set also. So let's just do alphabetical by tiers. So let's start right away in tier 1 with Ashe. What I like about her is that she has both a role as a trait bot and as a reroll carry, which is pretty much all you can ask for from a 1-cost unit. Laser Focus is definitely one of the stronger augments right now, and when you need to run Laser Core, she's always going to be there for you. What I dislike about Ashe is that compared to all the other 1-cost item holders, I feel like she is one of the weakest for attack damage items. For example, I find myself typically itemizing my 1-star Sivir over a 2-star Ashe, and I feel like Kayle with Duelist is just much easier to fit in than Ashe plus Sivir because there are just so few sure shots right now. Blitzcrank is one of the most oppressive champions, and he is just so dang tanky in the early game, and he scales well into the late game because he has a damage percent reduction on his ability. So if you compare him to 1-cost tanks from the past, such as Leona, where she does a flat damage reduction, he is definitely much better scaled into the late game. What I don't like about Blitzcrank is facing his dynamic defenses carry augment, where he just is pretty much unkillable whenever you're facing him, or the rocket grab because it forces you to grief your positioning every single round. Gangplank's in a bit of a weird spot right now. Last set, I really liked his flaming ricochet carry build, where he pretty much just popped everyone, but this type of thing is either too good or too weak, which is kind of like a double-edged sword. It's either the best augment in the game or the worst augment in the game. Get Paid is a little weird because you really need to get a 2-star Gangplank with other upgrades to make sure that you get kills with him in order to properly farm him out. One little fact that's not really known about Gangplank is that he does have an anti-heal wound effect, though it's not very reliable, so I'm not really sure why it's there. Next up, we have Kayle. Kayle is great because she is an underground unit, and all those econ traits are always super fun to kind of play around with. After that, she's a duelist, so she's a great item holder for your Vayne later on. And her carry augment is super interesting because she gets an upgrade similar to how she does in League of Legends whenever she reaches certain level thresholds. The only weird part about her is that her support augment Righteous Range is pretty much a scope weapons for some champions on your team, but the champions that really like scope weapons don't really fit in the synergies that Kayle has. Next up, we have Lucian. Lucian is really good because he fits in a lot of synergies, which you can mix and match really easily in the early game with. What I kind of don't like about him though is that he's kind of a clone of Lulu. He pretty much shoots a projectile in a direction, and it also kind of goes through units, even though it's slightly different than Lulu, but they pretty much have the same mana costs, but they pretty much fill the same role as a low mana cost AP carry. One thing that's a little unintuitive is that Lucian is an attack damage carry in League of Legends, but do not put attack damage items on him in TFT because he has very low base AD, and since all the items scale off of percent AD now, it's really bad to itemize him with something like a Deathblade, and I actually see people make that mistake all the time. Next up, we have Lulu. Lulu is probably one of my favorite 1-cost units because I am a huge fan of the AP openers, and she just fits that role perfectly because Gadgettine is such a strong early game trait. She can hold pretty much any AP item, and in the worst case, she could be a trait bot for Gadgettine throughout the rest of the game. I don't really have any hate to spread for Lulu, so we're just going to leave it all positive for that. Lux, what a champion because she got changed quite a bit from set 8 to 8.5, and the main thing that changed was her targeting. In set 8, she used to throw out bindings randomly at opponents, and now she focuses it on her targets. This does make her more consistent, but it makes her carry augment much worse, because before you would just win games outright because that random target that she focused could be the enemy carry, and you just one-tap them for an easy win. Now since she throws it at her target, you're targeting tanks, so her builds got a lot different. One thing I absolutely hate about Lux is that when she throws out her binding and your tank dies as she throws it out, the enemy team moves forward towards her backline, and oftentimes she misses her ability. Unlike Lulu, Lux is the exact opposite. I pretty much don't have many positive things to say about Lux. Now on to Nasus. Nasus fills a weird role where he is thought of as a tank, but he's actually a damage dealer. You can see his ability right here. It does have a slight bit of utility, a 40% chill, but I feel like he's much weaker than pretty much all the other 1-cost tanks right now, and he does less damage than all the 1-cost melee carries. For example, Gangplank does more damage than him, Blitzcrank, Pantheon, Poppy, Renekton, and Sylas, and Wukong are all tankier than him, so he's in a bit of a weird role. However, the stacks on stacks carry augment, even though it hasn't really been that great so far, it is probably one of the most interesting carry augments that I've seen to date, because it changes the identity of the champion, in a healthy way in my opinion. I'm not really sure how to define the whole health aspect, but it just feels really nice to play compared to some of the other augments that we'll discuss soon. Next up, we have Pantheon. Pantheon is definitely new in set 8.5. And unlike Nasus, the reason why he's good is because he actually crowd controls and stuns his target, which is a lot better than just chilling them for 40%. What I don't like about Pantheon is that his carry augment gives him a lot of magic resistance, but oftentimes you don't actually know whether you need this or not. And I find that the Poppy carry augment that gives a lot of armor is much more deadly than Pantheon because Pantheon attacks tanks, whereas Poppy attacks damage dealers in the back that are squishy. Another thing I don't like about Pantheon is that he has the heart trait, but I really feel like that doesn't really fit with his theme, and he doesn't really maximize the heart trait at all because he doesn't really cast all that often. I often find myself 2-starring my Pantheon in the early game and then not having someone to pair him up with as a tank. Whereas when I'm playing Blitzcrank, I pair him up with Renekton. When I'm playing Poppy, I pair her up with Wukong, and it's just a lot more fluid in that sense. Next up, we have Poppy. Poppy is not the tankiest unit. Wukong, I think, is better. Blitzcrank is a little tankier. Her damage isn't the highest, but she's kind of like an in-between type of unit. The great thing about Poppy is that she has a Gadgettine trait that we talked about before, which is so deadly in the early game because of the way item economy works. But the thing I hate about Poppy is that she throws her buckler at the farthest enemy, and oftentimes that means when you lose a round, their backline corner carry generally has around like 20% health, which is all damage that is just completely wasted. Of course, that problem gets solved by having bigger, better buckler, but you don't always get a chance to get this carry augment. Next up we have is Renekton. Renekton is one of the best early game units because he is both tanky and deals a bunch of damage, and he scales really well in the long early game fights. There have been so many fights where my Renekton solos the enemy team in the early game, but then he does fall off really hard later on. Sylas is a bit of a weird spot. He suffers from the same problem as Pantheon where he's a renegade unit, but it's hard to pair him up with other tanky renegades, and he just has to be kind of like a solo tank instead. I feel like his heal amount is very low compared to other units, unless you itemize him up, so I feel like his tankiness is just a lot worse than everyone else's at his cost level. However, he is an Anima squad, and getting a lot of stacks early can make the percent health damage a little bit better. Wukong is the last 1-cost unit, and he is one of the tankiest units in the early games. Similar to Blitzcrank, he's really great at just tanking multiple units because he gains armor and magic resist for each enemy he hits with his ability. He is probably one of the best early game tank item holders, and I think his carry augment transforms him into a different type of champion in a pretty creative way, similar to what Nasus does. His support augment kinda doesn't really make sense though. It's very similar to the Kayle problem with her support augment because a lot of the champions that would benefit from re-energize don't really want Wukong in their team comp, but maybe that's a feature that they kinda want to support. By the way, if you guys like this champion info layout that we have right here, this is on the website teamfight.lol, so definitely check that out if you're unsure of what each champion does, or if you want to get more info on their augments, stats, or traits. Now let's move on into the 2-cost units. Annie is one of my favorite 2-cost champions though because she has so many good synergies and she is a good hero as well. That's pretty rare. She's one of the tankiest 2-cost units that we've ever had without needing to be 3-star, but you can always use her as a typical tank item holder as well. The only bad thing about her is her carry augment. They changed this in the new set and even this new spell just isn't quite cutting the way it should be. Moving on into Camille. Camille's kind of been a trait bot. She can be used as a carry, but it seems that she's overshined a bit right now, especially since there are much better hacker builds that are available. I think she will make a comeback because adaptive defenses, when the numbers are a little bit stronger, or when the meta is a little bit different, can be very, very devastating. But apart from that, I kind of just never really played Camille that much, or just use her as a trait bot, especially with Hextech Retribution. Draven can carry on his own, and he is probably the opposite of Camille. So Draven works really well in pretty much any reroll comp focused around him because Draven is always the center of attention. I'd say his weakness is his reliance on Mecha Prime because it can be very, very difficult to get to 3 Mecha, and the early game navigating around that is kind of tricky since you don't want to just lose a lot of your units. Also, when you do hit him 3-star, when you do beat other players, you tend to only deal minimal damage to them because Draven is often your only unit alive. Moving on to Ezreal. Ezreal's got a wide range. He's a great support unit, especially with Raider Spoils, or as a trait bot he's really good. Underground gets you a lot of gold, but Rising Spellforce actually turns him into a pretty decent carry, and he works well in a lot of other reroll comps that could use 2-cost units such as Vi reroll. I think his only weakness right now is that you want to play him in parallel with the ultimate Ezreal, and you need to wait until you hit ultimate Ezreal. The only problem is you generally don't hold on to regular Ezreal because he doesn't really fit in the Infiniteam comp unless you're running Lucian reroll, which you typically don't do because ultimate Ezreal likes attack damage items, so it means that Lucian cannot really hold any of those items. Therefore, you likely don't have Ezreal by the time you do hit ultimate Ezreal, and then you have to end up rerolling in order to find him. Next up, we have Fiora. Fiora is one of those units that is kind of like a tank, but she's not as powerful as Annie. They are both Ox Forces, but in a duelist build, you kind of build lockets for your main tanks anyways, and Fiora isn't really going to be the star there. Fiora's never actually really shined so far in set 8 or 8.5, but she just is a solid Ox Force unit, and that's good enough, at least at the time of this recording. I have heard that there are some wacky Grand Challenge builds, and definitely try that out and let me know how it goes for you in the comments. From what some of my friends have been telling me, Quicksilver is the most important item on the Grand Challenge build in a vertical duelist comp. Next up, we have Jinx. Jinx is so weird because she's a ability power carry, but she's kind of built like a AD carry with her augments. For example, everyone goes boom, you get 9% attack speed, tripled after someone dies, and then get excited, she also gets attack speed, but she really does magic damage, so you don't want to put attack damage items on her, although you can. Generally, hybrid carries are always a little weird. They're either super broken or super bad, and there's not too much in between. She's also a great item holder for Miss Fortune. However, you generally don't like selling your Jinx and replacing the items onto Miss Fortune because you still need a 2-star copy of Jinx in your final Anima Squad build. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that she's too good of an item holder and too good of a unit that it kind of makes playing the game, especially in Anima Squad, a little bit awkward. Lee Sin is going to be one of those odd champions because Cleansing Safeguard was so defining to his carry build, but since they nerfed it, it just hasn't really been the same since. I wonder if they're going to remake this augment or if they're just going to buff this a little bit until it reaches that kind of sweet spot. Overall, he's a pretty good unit because he has 3 synergies, so he fits in a lot of comps. But both his augments, we already talked about Cleansing Safeguard, but Invigorate is just so weird to use. The benefit isn't really that great. I think 20% attack speed for your team is good, but the doubling on the target that you shield is so hard to line up, and it really only works with a Jax build. Next up, we have Malphite. Malphite is either the tankiest guy ever or he just dies super quickly, so you can't just slam any generic tank items on him. There's a difference between utility tank items and tanky tank items. So Malphite definitely likes the tanky tank items. Those are going to be Bramble Vest, Warmogs, Dragonclaw, things like that, Stone Plate, whereas the utility is going to be your Ionic Sparks, Sunfire Capes, and Redemptions. He definitely is a much better holder of the pure tank items, but I think a lot of people make the mistake of kind of mixing and matching the two builds, which again isn't the end of the world because sometimes you just have to build whatever items you get, but I feel like the item priorities are a little bit different on him. I also don't like that he's only a mascot because there just is only one mascot build. There's not really too much else there. Let's move on into Pyke though. Pyke is such an amazing unit. He's only good though when hackers are good, but you can play him as like just a generic threat unit, but he's not actually a threat because his ability is just really powerful because it's essentially an AoE stun, all from a 2-cost unit. There are not many 2-cost units that do AoE stuns at that radius. Like, yeah, Jinx can hit like 1 or 2 targets, maximum like 3, but Pyke can consistently hit whole teams, which makes him so powerful. So it kind of balances out the fact that his traits are kind of hard to play around with. Next up, we have Rell. Rell is great in the early game, and her carry augments are both very good. One is good for her reroll, the other one's good for her support. But the thing is, there aren't too many late game builds that play Rell, because there are just much better tank options at both Defender and Star Guardian, so just make sure you sell her later on unless she's 3-starred. Next up, we have Sivir. For some reason for me, Sivir is just so hard to find when you need her, but she shows up in your shop pretty much when you don't need her, and that's the whole sure shot problem that we have here. In the sure shots, we have a 1-cost, a 2-cost, a 4-cost, and a 5-cost. So what ends up happening is that since there's no 3-cost, it's kind of hard to pivot your team slowly as the game progresses. Also, since there's only one 1-cost sure shot, it's hard to play Ashe in the early game without being able to find Sivir. Apart from that, sure shot's power is just going to depend on like what the numbers are and what the meta is like. But she kind of suffers from that awkward balance just because of the way the traits break down. Next up, we have Vi. Vi is nice as an underground unit. Brawlers, if they're good in the early game, she's a great option, but I don't really like her ability. I love both her Augments Boxing Lesson and Unrelenting Force because it kind of transforms her into like a good support or a good tank, but I do not like her actual ability because one of the effects is sundering enemies for 4 seconds, which is reducing armor, so you might trick yourself into thinking you don't need a Last Whisper, but she dies really quickly if you're not 3-starring her, which doesn't really happen that often. So I feel like this effect pretty much just doesn't exist because you normally just build Last Whisper when you really need Sunder. Especially with Morgana added to the game, it makes this whole part of her ability pretty much useless. Combine that with the fact that she is an Underground, and Underground's carry is typically going to be Ezreal in a reroll comp at 2 costs, and he does magic damage, so it really only works with Samira, but a Samira comp isn't going to play a Vi later on in the game, because there are just better options in 4-cost tanks compared to 2-cost tanks. Next up, we have Yasuo. Yasuo is pretty much a trait bot as well, Duelist and Laser Core, but overall he's pretty solid just because he has nice CC. He's just never really like the star of the show in most cases. Next up, we have Alistar. Alistar is going to be your typical 3-cost tank that you don't really itemize. And that's just because his ability and traits just don't really lend himself that well to truly be a tank item holder. There are other 3-cost units that can hold items, but for Alistar, he just doesn't really have that strong of an effect. And that's because, like, you look at Pulverize, he CCs 1 unit in front of him. Compare that to Pyke, he does AoE CC, and that's at a lower cost. It's just not that effective when you're just CCing 1 tank, and that's kind of pretty much what your champion does. What Alistar does do well in is having a lot of traits, so it kind of makes sense that he's a little weaker. And that's just because you could fit him in a lot of other different comps. Next up, we have Gnar. Gnar is really powerful when you itemize him, and he can truly be his own carry. The only issue is that when he's not itemized, he is pretty much useless because melee pranksters that aren't tanky or don't do any CC are just pretty much useless. We have to compare him to Zoe from last set because that's who he replaced, and Zoe was a lot better as a support unit because she increased the damage that your team dealt to the units that she hit with her ability. However, Gnar, he's just a damage dealer, so unless you're itemizing him purely for damage, he's pretty useless after that. Jax suffers from a similar issue. He is great when you itemize him, useless when you don't, so he either just becomes a Mecha Prime bot or he is your primary carry in some other brawler build. Kai'Sa is very similar to Jinx in that she has great attack speed, but she does ability power damage, so it's kind of hard to find items that really mix with her, apart from like a Static Shiv and Rage Blade build, so it makes her very item dependent. But when you do get the right setup going for her, she is extremely strong and does a ton of damage. But you also have to come to grips with the fact that she's a 3-cost reroll, and you don't always hit 3-cost rerolls in most of your games. Contrast that with 1-cost reroll or 2-cost reroll when you pretty much always hit, unless you get like super unlucky. But 3-cost reroll is kind of that point where it's kind of an in-between where it's like, if you get lucky, you're going to get top 2. If you don't hit, you're going to get like 5th through 8th. And there's not really too much middle ground when it comes to 3-cost rerolls. Some people like that playstyle, some people don't, but it does kind of suck that the units in her traits are also not 3-cost, apart from Nilah, which really doesn't complement her that well. Next up, we have LeBlanc. LeBlanc is one of the strongest mid-game item holders for AP comps because she fits with a lot of synergies. She can hold both Blue Buff and Shojin, which can't be said about a lot of other units, where they generally prefer one over the other. And if you happen to hit a lot more copies of her when you're using her as an item holder, you could go ahead and just reroll her and 3-star her. The only weakness about her is that she can often get stuck on one unit, such as the Oxforce units, main tanks with lots of magic resistance, and that kind of really stops her from popping off because in a lot of games your carry just can't get stuck on a tank and expect to win. Next up, we have Morgana. She's one of the new threat units that we have at 3 costs. She's like a better version of Vi because 1, she survives longer because she's a range unit, and 2, she both sunders and shreds. She also gives your team much needed CC, so overall she's just a very good splashable unit. The only problem with her is that she can't really carry on her own, so you always need to use her as a splash unit, not as like a champion that you build around. Nilah is going to be one of the best tank duelists, best locket holder by far, especially with gifted, you just duplicate a locket, which is exactly what those types of builds need. The only unfortunate part about her is that I don't really think she fits in a lot of the Star Guardian builds. You kind of just use her if you need her as a trait bot, but that's really kind of all she has to it. However, a really strong part about Nilah is her early game because her heal is just so devastating, but then of course the heal falls off in the late game because it doesn't really scale that well. Next up we have Rammus. He's pretty okay. If you need a tanky CC unit, he's going to do the job. There's not really too much great about him. There's not really too much bad about him. He's just kind of like everything you'd kind of expect from what the champion's supposed to do. Decently tanky, not overly tanky, and decent CC when you need it. Riven is going to contrast to the other 3-cost tanks that we looked at already, such as Alistar, Rammus, and Nyla, because Riven can actually be one of those primary item holders. And the reason why is because if you look at the Anima squad trait, she is the tankiest member of that team, so she's of course gonna have to be the main tank. Unfortunately, that means in order to unlock her full potential, you need to 3-star her. If not, she's gonna fall off compared to other 4-cost tanks such as Echo and Garen and Aatrox, because that's just how the game is built. More expensive units typically are stronger, but less expensive units you're able to upgrade them faster and more reliably. Also, when you look at the Brawler trait, Warwick's mainly a damage dealer, so she's always going to be like the primary tank for some of her traits. That makes her pretty strong in a lot of builds, but of course in the Defender comp, you kind of leave her to the wayside because Garen and Shen are just much better at doing that type of job. But if you need to run her in Anima squad, she's kind of your only option. Next up, we have Shen. Shen is so powerful of an effect because he protects her carry, so you essentially just don't need a defensive item on them. You could just go full damage. You might not even need a healing item. And his ability is just something we really haven't seen in TFT before. The only thing I don't like about him is his Time Knife carry augment. It's either going to be so broken or so bad. I really don't think there's that much of an in-between. This goes for a lot of other augments in 4-cost such as Echo and Garen, because they have a very similar effect where they turn a tank into a damage dealer. I guess it's some sort of fantasy that Riot has for some of those champions, just to really change their identity a lot. But I feel like for these guys that are just mainly built to be tank units, it's not really a direction that I'm fond of. If you compare that to the Nasus augment that we saw before, Nasus does a lot of damage on his ability, so having a stacks on stacks carry augment definitely does make sense, and stacking is also a really fun mechanic. Compare this to Poppy's carry augment, where she gets a lot of armor. This makes her deal more damage and also makes her tankier, whereas this Shen one really just turns him into a damage dealer. Just wait till we talk about Echo, because I am going to lose my mind when I talk about it. Next up, we have Sona. Sona is just, again, Sona is very similar to LeBlanc in that she is one of the best AP item holders in the mid game, but she is a little less flexible because she really does prefer the blue buff over the Spear of Shojin. So that's why I think LeBlanc is a little bit better as an item holder. Though Sona is still adequate at holding those items, it's just not as flexible. However, she's still a very solid unit because she has 3 traits, and she provides both damage and support for your team. The only thing I don't like about her is her support augment, because this thing has been useless for so long because all the spell slingers already build a lot of mana items and they need to cast multiple times, so getting 50 mana at the start doesn't really help your team out that much from what I've seen so far. You have to get a super specific augment build in order to kind of make it work, and if you're able to choose 3 of your augments, there are a billion other combinations that work just as well. So if you compare her support augment to pretty much everyone else's, it's a lot less flexible. Next up, we have Vayne. What's good about her is that she can be the primary carry of the Duelist build, because Duelists generally revolve around attack damage items, and she is the best attack damage carry on that trait. However, her downside is in Anima squad, you normally play around Misfortune unless you get specifically her carry augment and nothing else. So she's just kind of like a trait bot in Anima squad, which kind of is a shame because she's a 3-cost unit and one of the more expensive ones of the trait. Duo carry comps have always been very difficult in TFT due to the way items scale. So even though there is some world where you can have triple item Vayne, triple item MF, and triple item on a tank, it's a very rare situation, and I don't really know how to actually fix that. There have been other successful duo carry comps in the past, but even in those builds, they still rely more on one carry than the other. The last 3-cost unit we have is Vex, and she is new to the set, but unfortunately she really only fits in one build, which is the Mascot carry build, where she builds blue buff, AP items, and it's just kind of like the new stall comp of the set. In Riftwalker, yeah, she has her uses just as a trait bot, but that's really all she is. She provides no utility to the team, and you really just don't care about her. I guess there always has to be some mixing and matching between being the main guy in one trait and being a secondary person in another. But at least the good news is that in her Mascot build, you don't really need to build a healing item on her because she generally heals from the Mascot. So even if you take a little bit of damage, you don't need to build anything defensive and just focus purely on killing the enemy team. Time for the 4-cost carries. This is where you find your primary tanks, primary carries for most comps in the game, and starting with Aatrox. He is a new 4-cost threat tank in the set, and honestly, I love this improvement from Zac because this guy can also pack a punch, and he's kind of like not really a drain tank, but he does have the capacity to carry, yet still be decently tanky at the same time. He's like a version of Fiddlesticks that doesn't CC, so he's kind of like a 4-cost version of Fiddlesticks in my opinion. The great part about him is that he could use full tank items or kind of like those bruisery items, so he definitely has flexible builds out for him. The downside to Aatrox, however, is that he is a threat unit, so you generally don't build your team around him, and he's kind of those like worst case scenario type of champions. And that's going to happen for the next two champions we're going to go over, Aurelion Sol and Bel'Veth. It's like you're never starting the game planning to go for them. If you see them, great, use them until you find your actual carry. If you don't see them, that's also great because that means you probably found your carry a little bit earlier. So with that in mind, let's just focus on the positive of all these threat champions at 4-cost. So Aesol is a surprisingly good carry because he is one of the ways to get anti-heal if you don't get it from Sunfire Board, Sunfire Cape, or Morellonomicon. Obviously, there's some games where you really need the effect, but most games you can sometimes get away without it. What I also like is that both his augments either turn him into a primary carry with his carry augment, or a great AoE CC from a support augment, and there aren't really too many champions that are this affected by the augments quite as much. I've had many games where I resorted to carry Aesol because I couldn't hit my preferred carry augment, and I did just fine in these games with like a Shojin and some general AP items. As for a support augment, there aren't many champions in the game that could CC this many people, so this definitely is a plus because you have to also remember that his ability burns the entire team. Next up, we have Bel'Veth. Bel'Veth uses a lot of those weird attack damage items. Great with lifesteal items, great with Edge and Night, great with Titan's Resolve, Runon. So all the like funky AD items, Bel'Veth is going to be your primary holder for those. And that makes her very useful in those games where you're just trying to survive and out-tempo everyone else. Because sometimes you have to slam suboptimal items early in order to win streak, or just save a bunch of your life total. Her carry augment also saves her an item because she gets so much lifesteal, it's actually pretty nuts, and it solves her one issue of lacking survivability. Next up, we have Echo. Echo is going to be one of your go-to 4-cost tanks in all the AP builds because he's an Aegis, Star Guardian, and you could also even fit in Prankster in sometimes. So both Anima Squad, Star Guardian, Spellslingers all make really good use of Echo. He's also great at taunting enemy units, so he pretty much always draw aggro from their carries, even the ones that are hackered into your backline. But the one thing I don't like about him is his carry augment. They changed it so that it no longer slows enemies' attack speed, but I always thought that was the point of playing Echo, kind of using him as a support. As I stated before, I feel like they really like turning tanks into damage dealers, and you have to do all sorts of wacky builds to make them actually work, which aren't typical items that Echo uses. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? So far, I don't really like it personally, but maybe there is some use for it later on. But that brings me to my next issue. Let's say that there is a good damage build for this Echo and the Garen. I feel like it's either going to be too good or too bad. We saw this with the Shen augment. It was obviously too good and they had to hotfix it right away. But it's a very fine line between nuking the entire enemy team or having them live and then kill your Echo, and it pretty much doesn't really do anything after that. It's kind of a struggle that all damage dealers kind of face, but since they're a tank, it seems a little bit odd to me. But let's move on into Garen. He is one of the best 4-cost tanks because he has an AoE CC ability, and that means he's kind of splashable into almost any comp. But again, his carry augment removes the stun, so you really just have to pray he nukes everyone or just like has lifesteal that he could cast multiple times. And you pretty much have to change your entire game plan around that, which I think it's kind of weird. For example, Nasus's ability, let's compare to Nasus again. While you do build your team around Nasus's carry augment, he doesn't really lose out on any features that he previously had. And when Garen's main identity is just like a stun bot 4-cost tank, which has pretty much been in every single TFT set that we've ever had, I don't know if it's just something that I'm not used to, but it just seems like very counterintuitive. I guess with Mecha Prime, there are a lot more creative opportunities that you can kind of build up, but it's just not really my cup of tea because again, I feel like it's just going to be super overpowered or just super underpowered. Next up, we have Jhin. Jhin has always been one of my go-to AD carries in League of Legends, so I definitely welcome him in the new set. I really like his new ability because it targets lowest health enemies. So it kind of solved one of his issues from previous sets where sometimes he would just be aiming in the wrong direction. The only thing I don't like about him are his traits. Riftwalker and Renegade, while Riftwalker is really cool, I don't really think he fits the whole Renegade role. For example, I would have thought Jhin would be more of something like a sure shot champion, so for me it's not really that thematic from a trait perspective. Moving on into Miss Fortune, what's there not to like? Anima Squad, Ace, and Quick Draw. And since Ace is kind of like one of those unique traits, she is very splashable in a lot of different comps. Well, the only thing she is kind of missing since she's got great AoE is needing very specific items. Obviously, I don't mind that champions do need specific items, but a Miss Fortune without any sort of mana regeneration is pretty useless, which kind of is a shame. So you could get her to 2-star, but if you don't get that 1 tier that you need to build like a Spear of Shojin, games can feel really awful. For example, if you compare her to Neeko, she also likes mana items, but let's say there's some crazy game where you get absolutely 0 tiers, you could always just go into Vertical Star Guardian to get mana regeneration instead. Miss Fortune doesn't really have that other option, so you're kind of just stuck with that if you just happen to not hit any mana items, which definitely has happened to me before, and maybe I'm like overreacting to that. Moving on into Neeko, there's nothing really wrong with Neeko. I just felt like it was kind of boring to swap out Talia for Neeko. I feel like Talia's ability was much cooler because it was something that we haven't really seen before. Compare that to Neeko, where she's literally the same traits, literally the same cost, literally almost like the same mana cost, so that means the same items. It was just kind of more of a question of like, why even replace Talia? Maybe we could have just changed one of Talia's augments instead and just like left it at that. But I feel like Neeko didn't really add anything to this set, and I feel like that is their downside. Even though in a vacuum there's like nothing really wrong with her, it was just kind of like a why did they add this champion? If you guys want to hear some jokes about this whole spiel, check out this short video I made about the presidents discussing Star Guardian comps. Moving on into Samira, she's going to be Ace Underground Sure Shot, and sometimes you hit Samira when you're playing Underground and sometimes you don't, and that really is make or break for your entire game. Sometimes you just automatically win the game because you get a lot of Underground cash outs. She is by far the best Sure Shot. We talked about this before. Sure Shots are a 1, 2, 4, 5 type of trait, and she is really just make or break. So when you do get her, amazing, but when you're really needing her, you don't really have any other options. You have to use like a Bel'Veth or something as like a temporary carry. But when you're building your entire team around one champion, it can feel really bad when you just don't hit her. Of course, this is true for every champion, but if you're going like Spell Slingers, you have the option of Neeko and Twisted Fate. If you need tanks, you could always use a threat unit like Aatrox. But the thing about tanks versus damage dealers is that damage dealers are mainly the champions that you build your entire team around, so it's much easier to replace a tank than a damage dealer. Also, for AP builds, you have a lot more item holders in Kai'Sa, LeBlanc, and Sona. And when you compare the 3-cost units for AD builds, it's going to be your Gnars and your Vaynes. But the thing is, Gnar and Vayne don't really build into any comp that uses Samira, so it's really hard to use Vayne as an AD item holder for her. For example, with Kai'Sa, she's a Star Guardian, so you could easily pivot into Neeko. LeBlanc and Sona are a Spell Slinger, so you could go into either TF or Neeko. But Samira, you don't really have any 3-cost Sure Shot, there's no 3-cost Underground, and there's no like 3-cost Ace that can kind of help her out. You literally have to skip a whole step in order to get Samira, which makes her very polarizing in that when you do hit her, it's the best thing ever, but when you don't, it feels really bad. That's really all there is to say. Moving on into Twisted Fate, he is one of the cooler champions in the game, and it's not because I'm biased. I always love TF in TFT sets because he's one of my favorite league champions, if not the favorite. But I feel like he is a mix between attack speed and ability power that is done in the right way. So for Kai'Sa is always going to be like super broken or super bad. And right now she's on the weaker side, I'd say. But last set, it was like one of the primary comps that everyone used throughout the entire set. Compare that to Twisted Fate, where yeah, he likes attack speed, but it's also built into his kit. It just somehow makes it feel not that awkward. I'm always going to use this comparison to Zeri from one of the previous sets where she dealt both AD and AP damage, and she was pretty much just never used the entire set. But I feel like with Twisted Fate's trait with Duelist and Spellslinger, it gives him two different options to really shine. The only weird part about him is that in Infiniteam, you primarily play around Ultimate Ezreal and Sivir, so he kind of doesn't really find a true home there and is just kind of like a damage dealing trait bot that's also expensive, which is generally something you don't really like in a specific team. Next up we have Viego. So Viego, I loved him in the previous set, but right now he's having a hard time figuring himself out as a primary carry, and I always thought of him as such. I don't really see him being like an Ox Force tank, which is generally what he's just used for now. He's just used as your 4th Ox Force unit. But I haven't seen any good Viego Renegade build, and I'm really looking forward to that in the future. They spent pretty much the entirety of set 8 trying to figure out what the best targeting for Viego is, and once they finally got a lot of progress on that, he just really hasn't found his spot as like a real unit in the new set. He's literally just there for Ox Force and pretty much nothing else. I haven't seen any Viego primary carries. At least for me, I haven't seen any primary carry Viegos for that matter. Next up, we have Warwick. Warwick is admin, brawler, and laser core. So I think the core concept of Warwick is pretty cool. He's kind of like an attack speed melee based champion, similar to like Yone Challenger from previous sets. But one awkward thing about Warwick is that a lot of times he's used as a carry mainly in the laser core comp, which means that most of your damage comes from laser core and not from the champion himself. And that can make his itemization really awkward because sometimes you just need him to live, which means that like full damage build Warwicks kind of don't really work that well in my opinion. It's similar to Bel'Veth, she needs some sort of survivability. And sometimes the Omnivamp that he gets from his passive just really isn't enough. Thinking about this set, there aren't really many attack speed melee champions that kind of work. It's a very difficult thing to kind of figure out because they need so many things working on them. You want Edge and Knight, you want some sort of healing on them, you might want something like a Titan's Resolve because they're going to get full stacks all the time, but then you also need stuff like Last Whisper. So that's like 4 different things that we listed out for some of these champions, and you just can't build 4 items on someone. Sometimes they even want something like an RFC, which is what Jax uses to solve his problems, but that doesn't really work that well for Warwick because he kind of charges to his next enemy. So I feel like itemizing for him is a lot different than itemizing for Jax and Bel'Veth, which are kind of the other 2 attack-based champions. Compare that to Gnar, where he just kind of nukes people. His build is pretty simple, but I feel like Warwick's is a little bit trickier because again, a lot of his damage comes from the Laser Core trait, and Laser Core doesn't buff the champion, it's just the trait alone, and that really kind of makes him not take advantage of the lifesteal built into his kit that much. What I do like about Warwick is that he is an admin, so you can get pretty creative with what type of stats you give him. Finally, let's move on into the legendary units. So starting with Fiddlesticks, wow, he's just like everything you want in a legendary unit. He's like semi-tanky, he AoE CCs, he can use pretty much any AP or tank item, and he's splashable in every single comp because of the way threat works. He also has this really cool mechanic of Corrupted where even though it hasn't really been taken advantage of yet, you could just like leave him in the backline and let him hopefully clean up everyone at the end of the fight. There's not really too much bad I can say about him except that sometimes I just see him played way too often, which is kind of what the stuff I was complimenting him on before. Next up we have Janna. Janna is pretty interesting because I really like the way that they dealt with her augments. The support one is really interesting because it really makes use of the Forecaster trait, even though I haven't seen it being played that much, and Category 5 turns her into a true carry. And again, I feel like this is one of those times where changing her identity actually worked out well, and I can't really explain why. Maybe changing someone from a CC champion into a carry one is much easier than changing a tank into a damage carry, but Category 5 pretty much does everything you would expect it to do, while also not losing her core identity. It'd be the same thing as like making Category 5 add maybe like 50 ability power but removing her stun. Obviously that might be too broken because she'll just one-tap everything so you don't need to stun in the first place. So again, it runs into the problem of being either way too OP or way too weak if she like doesn't get enough ability power. The only bad part about Janna is that I feel like a lot of times you see her a lot in your shop, but the Forecaster trait doesn't really benefit you. So instead of splashing her in like a Fiddlesticks or an Urgot, you just end up skipping her and not using her at all. Next up, we have Leona. So Leona's pretty weird because we haven't really seen an ability like hers in TFT. If you compare that to like Janna or Fiddlesticks where they just deal like an AoE CC, like we've seen that tons of times before. But for Leona, it's kind of like a single target semi-AoE type of spell, and she also has very odd traits. Mecha Prime makes sense, because that's like her theme. Aegis, because she's a tank, but then Renegade is just kind of there randomly. I don't really know why she's a Renegade, because I don't really see her being used that well as a last carry standing. Another thing I don't like about her is that a lot of times you don't even Mecha Prime Leona. You're Mecha Priming either your Draven and Draven carry, or your Garen as your main tank, and the fact that you don't Mecha Prime the legendary unit of the trait feels kind of bad because what's the point of even hitting her in those cases? Mordekaiser is one of the more interesting champions. So contrast to Leona, where I don't really think she matches up with her traits, Mordekaiser really does, because laser cores deal magic damage and his ability reduces magic resistance. So I've always thought that was kind of cool. It makes it so you don't need to build Static Shiv or Ionic Spark as badly. And we also really haven't seen one of those like nuke AP champions as a melee. And another thing about him is that he could use both tank and AP items really well, similar to Fiddlesticks, and he's kind of semi-splashable because of the Ace trait. I wouldn't say he's like as splashable as like Fiddle or Urgot, but he's one of the next best options. Next up, we have Nunu. Nunu is probably the most fun legendary to play because he just rolls around the entire map and just generally is annoying, which kind of like matches up with the theme for him, and it's just really funny to see. I really like what they did with the augments where he gains movement speed to really play into that archetype even further. The only thing bad about him is kind of his movement targeting, because sometimes I feel like he's just running around hitting 0 enemies on the map, and I just really wonder what he's doing spinning around in circles not hitting anyone. Syndra is a unit that we've kind of seen before, pulling units in from the bench, but she does it a little bit differently. There's not really too much to say about her. I feel like she's kind of one of those like expected legendary type of units, kind of using an idea from a previous set but doing it in a different way. I like that she's a Star Guardian because that really makes mana regeneration a lot better on her. But the strength of Syndra really depends on the state of the game, whether it's in the early part of the late game or like the late part of the late game, because she definitely gets stronger the later the game goes on because you can pull even more powerful units from your bench. Next up, we have Ezreal. Ezreal is the only new legendary of the set, and I think he does pack a pretty good punch. I feel like they shouldn't have removed Aphelios because Aphelios was unique in that he had different abilities that you could kind of mix and choose with, and they could have replaced maybe like Syndra or Janna or Fiddlesticks, which kind of were champions that we've kind of seen before, such as like pulling units from the bench or AoE CC. But I feel like Aphelios was in that kind of like new zone where like tailoring his abilities based on like what the enemy's playing was a pretty cool thing to think about whenever you're playing. So I do wish that they didn't have to kill Aphelios to make room for Ultimate Ezreal, but I do like the whole parallel kind of dynamic. It reminds me of the Jinx and Vi sister trait from before, and his ability is really cool. People kind of compared it to a Victor legendary from the past, but it's more of the AD version than the AP version. And I just realized from looking at this, they probably could have made the attack damage ratio 1.33, 1.33, and then 3.77, so it kind of looks like the Leet speak type of thing. I just noticed that. I don't know if they did that on purpose. They kind of do this. Like if you look at Jhin, he's a 4 cost, 44 armor, 44 magic resist, things like that. They kind of leave these Easter eggs in for some of these champions. So let's move on into Urgot. So what doesn't Urgot have? He has high damage, he has an AoE CC, and he farms you items. So I like him a lot because he does all those things, but I also don't like him because it's like, he's just got too much going on for him. I feel like they should have maybe leaned into one of the identities a little bit more, because the main champion I would compare him to is Bard from his previous set. Legendary Bard would farm you better odds in your shop so you get more legendaries. So Urgot kind of does the same thing because he gives you more gold, so you have more opportunities to roll for like better units. Bard also had an AoE CC, Urgot has an AoE CC, but Bard didn't like kill tanks. Urgot can also kill tanks. So it's like, why did they make this person? I don't really know. Also, he's a threat, so he's more splashable, whereas Bard kind of had to fit into some of his, I believe it was Mystic comps. Of course, you still could splash the Bard, but it's definitely not anywhere near as splashable as like someone like Urgot. That's going to be all the champions for this set in 8.5. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. It is a little bit different than what I've done before because it's more of like an opinion piece than like stuff based on like data or like pure strategy. It's just kind of like my pros and cons, love and hate for every single champion. So let me know if you all want similar videos to this in the future. But apart from that, let me know what your favorite champs are in the comments below. Either the like most favorite or least favorite parts about a certain champion. And I hope to see you all in my next video. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.